Mr. Carroll, if you'd pick up that piece of styrofoam, I'm not going to ask you to estimate the exact weight, but does it weigh practically nothing in your hand?
Practically nothing.
Okay, and the rest of it is here, balanced on this pencil, and I'm going to guess it weighs a pound and a half, 2 pounds. We've been talking about a lot of things here. I think Mr. Calabrese, or actually Mr. Wayne, I'm going to start with. Aren't we talking about a multitude of different products here? I just want to go through it. We're talking about things like this, which are really, they're the equivalent of the toy that we all grew up with. Extremely lightweight, really couldn't get over 400 feet, can't go a long distance, notwithstanding that it might have a camera mounted on it. This is, in fact, an extension of what children grew up with, remote controls that were available 50 years ago. Is that right?
Well, I don't think so, actually. I think it looks a little bit like what my son used to play with, but honestly, it's a little bit like the difference between a plug-in phone and an iPhone.
Well, and I want to make sure I get to the point, which is, and Mr. Carroll, I started with you, from a safety standpoint, the damage that this product would do, from a safety standpoint, if it falls on your roof and so on, is substantially similar, perhaps, to what that old little alcohol-fired plane that I grew up flying would do, right?
That particular drone, yes, sir.
Okay. So the first question we have to ask is, are we addressing products based on their risk of safety, right? It's something that your company deals with.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. And the second one, of course, is the FAA. And I heard a lot of comments. I don't know how many pilots are in the room. They're probably, if there are, they're all better pilots than I am. But for 4 decades, I've been flying nearly. And during those years, the one thing I knew was that my floor was 500 feet. And the ceiling of these products is 400 feet. And there's a reason for that, which is that I'm not allowed to come down, except by an airport, into the remote control toy airspace. And these products, if they want to remain unregulated, have to stay below where I'm allowed to fly. Again, reasonable safety standard today. Is that correct in your estimation?
I think for that particular aircraft, yes, but I think there are many other different
Right,
aircrafts.
and we're talking about heavier aircraft, the 30-pound, 40-pound drone. It's still covered by the 400-foot lid, but there's a different question of if it falls. So I want to go through a number of quick questions. Mr. Calabrese, you're not an advocate of the status quo. That's a given. But let me ask a couple of questions. Today, the Realtors or Association represented by Mr. Policron next to you, if they have the permission of the owner and they fly only over the owner's airspace or ground space, unless they have the waiver for commercial use, they're breaking the law. Flying this product or one very similar over somebody's own private property with their permission, they have to get a kind of a weird exemption that says they can use it for commercial purposes. It takes time. They have to describe in detail. Wouldn't you agree that the private use or even the commercial use over one's own property is an example where perhaps the government needs to weigh in and say, you know what, commercial use with the owner's permission in which you're only flying over their land, we never should have had regulations over it. Is it really any different than if I raise a balloon up that has a camera on it? I'd just like to get your comments on it because I want to try and divide the concerns we all have with a question of, are we even approaching this based on intrusion into my privacy versus the right of a landowner to regulate what goes on in their own area?
So certainly from a privacy point of view, and I can't speak to the safety issues, you've always had the ability to consent to sort of essentially your own, giving up your own personal information. And I think it probably is an appropriate, I'm sure I could think of a fact pattern where it wasn't the case, but by and large, you can certainly make a case that that falls under consent and that collection is appropriate. You know, typically the drones are not limited in that way, so that makes it harder, but certainly that's a place to start.
Sure. Well, and I'm going to ask you to answer sort of on behalf of realtors. If in the near future the FAA looks and says if a commercial use is only over somebody's own property. Now, that would include, I'm a farmer, I'm flying it over my own property, but that's a commercial use when I do so. If I'm exclusively flying over my own property, taking my own risk, and so on, do I need a commercial waiver, or in fact, should we take those out and eliminate the bureaucracy of it? And in your case, if you're only photographing and flying over the property of the client, if you will, is there really any reason in your estimation that that isn't a consent for these products? And let's assume for a moment we're talking about the 30-pound aircraft and below.
I would concur explicitly that I would want the right to do that. Yes, sir.
Okay, and I'm going to close fairly quickly, even though there's nobody else left, but with just a couple of quick questions. Mr. Calabrese, you had a lot of concerns. Let's talk about privacy for a moment. I'm going to ask you, because this committee does have, beyond the commercial questions of this hearing, we certainly are the committee of people's civil rights and people's constitutional rights, including privacy. These vehicles, large and small, represent a cheap and easy extension of a problem that is as old as the Brownie Instamatic camera, isn't it?
Yes.
And we're dealing with something where, in your estimation, I'm leading you, but that this committee should look at privacy questions. And my question to you in a more open format is, should we look at them, assuming that these are going to make it pervasive, but should we look at them equally based on, if you will, the body camera, this product, the man who simply has a hillside and a telephoto lens that looks down on your backyard? Should we be looking at those holistically, and should this committee begin to look at that in light of, if you will, the pervasiveness of high-resolution, long-range capable cameras?
Certainly, the committee should explore all the new technologies. I mean, that's something we've talked about for a while. I mean, the great example of this is that we haven't talked so much about is stingray devices that can capture cell phone and can be used to learn your location from your cell phone.
We've been working pretty good on those in Congress.
You're making some headway. You're definitely raising some attention. So I do think that all of these need to be addressed. I don't think they all need to be addressed together. I mean, I think that's a very big bite. And nor are they all the same. They don't raise the same issues. So I guess I would encourage Congress to continue to look at some of these different things. Mr. Poe's bill, I think, is a great way to say, let's have the warrant standard for government access, and then we can, again, deal with some of the trickier issues around how private collection happens.
Okay, and I'm going to follow up quickly on the warrant, and if somebody else wants a second round, I'm going to give them that until the bell rings. But you mentioned warrant, and that's an area of interest to me. Let's assume for a moment that police have a myriad of good reasons, and other law enforcement, safety and so on, to fly just to see what's happening. In other words, to be in the air to see if there's a fire, to be in the air for other reasons, and that those reasons are broadly in the public interest. Would you agree that that can happen?
Sure.
So, again, this committee, the Committee of the Constitution, you suggested that we look at it. You mentioned Judge Poe's bill. Aren't you also, in a sense, saying that we need to address the question of, if you collect it through other purposes, but you're law enforcement, public safety, that you're perfectly willing to collect it, but you've still got to get a warrant and recollect it in order to be able to use it? Is that sort of implied in yours, that we will collect all the time, but the question of, for example, knocking on the door is a question of, geez, somebody reported that we saw something. What is the basis then to enter the home? Because this is going to happen. There's no question at all you're going to have drones in the air on behalf of public safety.
So there's a lot there. Thank you for the opportunity to address it. I think, first of all, talking about non-law enforcement use is not talking about warrants. So if we're talking about how the police, or excuse me, how like a firefighter can use a drone, we're talking about government use but not law enforcement use, and I don't think we're talking about a warrant. I do think that we can see exceptions to the warrant requirement. So if you're flying for example, in a public place and you see a criminal activity, or you see a fleeing suspect, you can continue to follow them the same way law enforcement can continue to follow them. We have clear rules around exigency there. We also could, I think, see some exceptions for if we had a suppression remedy, for example. So I'm a law enforcement. I'm looking for a missing person. I'm not looking for criminal conduct, and I happen to find some. If there is a clearly defined non-law enforcement but police activity, you may be able to do that collection. It may fall in an exception or may not be admissible in court. I mean, there are fine gradations that we have to have here. So I don't want to oversimplify the issue, but I do think that given the ability and the possibility of persistent long-term surveillance, something I think the public rightly fears, they should have the security of when they see that drone up there, knowing that the police have gotten a neutral third-party judge to approve that kind of surveillance on them and that there's a good reason for it.
Thank you. And I'm going to quickly close with a story. Last weekend, I was at my home in the backyard, and a drone flew over, and it hovered over my backyard. As far as I could tell, it's a Phantom 3 Professional. And it had a camera on board, nicely stabilized, and it hovered exactly over where it could see me. And then it went away, and I jumped up, followed it, found that one of my neighbors had a friend, a very adult friend, who had flown it on this mission. I have no idea what he's going to do with it. Being a politician, I'm going to assume that it will show up somewhere, someday, somehow. What was interesting for me was I know how easily violated people feel when there's a camera that is no more able to track me than across a ravine somebody with a long-range camera would, but it felt very personal. So as a member of one of the committees that's been called on to have a likely series of hearings on this, I want to make it clear today was about commercial. And I brought up one of the many points of, are there exemptions where we can carve some of the commercial out so that we take that out of the clutter and we start viewing some of the issues that are particularly important to Mr. Marino as a former prosecutor and others on the committee, and we start dealing with the privacy, the warrant questions, and so on that come from it. So although this hearing was limited in scope, I want to thank you all for helping us expand our understanding and, of course, probably define some of the future areas of other hearings of this committee. I want to ask all of you if you have any additional comments or statements. I'll keep the record open for 5 remaining days so that you can add supplemental material, and would also ask that if we receive any questions, would you be glad to respond to those in writing from members that were not able to be here today. I want to thank you for the answer in the affirmative, and looking left and right, we stand adjourned.